JNU Academic is an entirely student-driven open forum. The foundational principles of the forum is to invest in 11 possibilities of democratic and civil discourse inside the campus on issues that are of social relevance. Since its inception in 2017, the forum has conducted talks, reading sessions, and book discussions touching various themes and materials. The forum is blessed to have a generous and engaging audience right from the time when we began the initiative. I would request this esteemed audience to please consider contributing monetarily. Your donations help us running the initiative and pays for our posters and tea. So please donate. There you can pay us as in hard cash, and there is a scan code as well, so you can pay by that as well. It's a moment of special pleasure for us as we are hosting Professor Gudavathi's book discussion. In fact, Ajay sir was one of the first speakers with which we began our journey almost 5 years ago. Today's discussion revolves around his latest book, Politics, Ethics and Emotions in New India. This, he writes in his introduction, is a sequel to his previous popular work, India After Modi, Populism and the Indian Right. While his previous book, as he notes, examined the populist strategies and popular support enjoyed by the Indian right and reasons for its expanding support, the current volume attempts to explain what followed after the Indian right gained that support. I reserve my observations and queries about the book for Q&A session later. With this, let me now introduce the panelists of today's event. Ajay Gudavathi, the author of the book for discussion today, is an associate professor at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. His publications include Politics of Post-Civil Society, Contemporary History of Political Movements in India, Maoism, Democracy and Globalization, Cross Currents in Indian Politics, and India After Modi. He is currently Associate Member, Institute for Humanities, Simon Fraser University, Canada. He was earlier Visiting Professor, Center for Modern Indian Studies, Visiting Fellow, Center for Citizenship, Civil Society and Rule of Law, University of Aberdeen, and Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow at SOAS. Apart from his academic contributions, Dr. Gudavathi is known for his teaching and popular courses that he offers at the center and his interventions as a public intellectual in popular media. Anupama Roy, the chair for today's session, will be chairing the session today, is a professor at the Center for Political Studies in the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her research focuses on debates on citizenship, political anthropology of public institutions, constitutionalism, law and democracy, and gender studies. Her most recent publication, which we were fortunate to host as well, book discussion of which, Citizenship, Regimes, Law and Belonging, the CA and the NRC in India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. She is the co-author of the book Election Commission of India, Institutionalizing Democratic Uncertainties, and the author of Mapping Citizenship in India. Citizenship in India, Gendered Citizenship, Historical and Conceptual Explorations. She has also co-edited a number of volumes. Her research articles have also appeared in various national and international journals. She was a visiting scholar in various universities, including Sydney University, University of Warwick, University of Würzburg, Germany. Now, coming to our discussants, first discussant for today's event, Prasanta Chakravarti, is Associate Professor of English at the University of Delhi and the editor of the web journal humanitiesunderground.org. His most recent work is Populism and Its Limits. His other works include Time, Doubt, and The Wonder in the Humanities, Between the Tick and the Talk, The Opulence of Existence, Essays on Aesthetics and Politics, Like Parchment in the Fire, Literature and Radicalism in the English Civil War, and an edited volume on contemporary writings on humanities, titled Sharpnel Minima, Writings from Humanities Underground. Chakravarti nurtures a particular interest in poetry and poetics and enjoys translating significant contemporary literary writings into English. Our second discussant, Vivek Yadav, specializes in democratic theory with focus on modern Indian politics. He is an assistant professor at Department of Political Science, Ashoka University. His doctoral dissertation and ongoing book project provide a genealogical account of political drama, a degraded form of democratic practice that has arisen in Indian politics over the past decade and a half. Offering an alternative to the prevailing academic narrative of the global rise of populism, the project theorizes Indian democracy by taking as its starting point the conceptual vocabulary of its practitioners. Dr. Yadav is also a student of philosophical aesthetics and has a special interest in rasa, a distinguished Indian tradition of philosophy of art, to which his second book project is devoted. Dr. Yadav received his PhD from Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. He also holds a Master's in Public Administration from the same university and an MBBS from Sage GS Medical College, KEM Hospital, Mumbai. So he is a real doctor as well, unlike most of us here.
People fall sick after discussion.
Third discussant for today's event is Rajoshi Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor here at the Center for Political Studies. Is known for his writings in English and Bengali on Marxian aesthetics, refugee politics, urbanization and development, and contemporary student politics. His research articles have appeared in numerous international journals, including Journal of Borderland Studies, Studies in History, Postcolonial Studies, and the Economic and Political Weekly, etc. Dr. Dasgupta is presently preparing a forthcoming monograph titled The Ascetic Modality. Rajeshi is also currently involved in a research collaboration with York University on peri-urbanization in India, focusing on West Bengal and the National Capital Region. Before handing it over to Professor Roy, it is mandatory that I say something about the overall theme and the figures of the discussion today. Along the implantment strategies of modernization theory, with its key premise on progress, have animated Indian social sciences analysis in its various avatars. Steady movement towards development, progress, regime of rights, rule of law, and popular sovereignty have been the chief analytical tropes which have been used to capture it. Analysis of Indian democracy and democratization has for long been largely shaped by these concerns. However, this is not exceptional to India. Across the world, nearly all varieties of liberal democracies uses such foundational discourse to serve their legitimation function. However, as Wendy Brown asks, with foremost exactitude, what happens when these foundational presuppositions are challenged? What kinds of political cultures are produced by this destabilization of founding narratives in signal terms? What kinds of politics do these narratives produce in their destabilized or broken form? How does their disintegration affect left and liberal political aims, possibilities, sentiments, and discourse? How do we live in these broken narratives when nothing has taken their place? And how do we conjure an emancipatory future when the very fabric of universal justice premised on the universal man of liberal dreams is in tatters? While a comprehensive answer to these questions is beyond the scope of a single discussion or a single volume, however, what unites our esteemed panelists today is their endeavor in precisely asking such questions in their own ways and then grapple with the issues, histories, and surprises that one is thrown at in the process. As a student of their works, I feel a common concern that connects and enchants almost all of them is their enduring passion for making sense of the ever transitory and an increasingly disoriented present. It would not be an overstatement to say that they are, in their own subfields, the quintessential theorists of the present. However, the present is almost always presented in their work not as a diary document of the fleeting now, but as a structured experience. I hope today's discussion will give us notes and frames which can help us grapple with this uphill, risky, and yet an interesting iterative task of theorizing the present. Thank you.
Hello, and this seems to be a very wet and beautiful afternoon and the right afternoon to have a discussion on emotions. And so this is somewhat of a reversal of what I thought I would be doing. And Vipanchika had asked me to come at the end and take only 5 to 10 minutes to speak. And so I'd assumed that I'd be coming after the panelists have spoken. But since I've come before they've had their chance to discuss the book, and I thought that I would have then had the opportunity to open some other frontiers not taken up by them, hopefully. What I would do is first congratulate Ajay for this wonderful book, and also because Ajay is consistently writing on themes in a way which is so intelligent and it strikes the chord with the kind of arguments that all of us have in mind, but are not possibly able to frame it the way Ajay has been able to frame it. So, congratulations also, Ajay. And that is one of the questions that I would have for you, right? And this is a part of. So I'm not going to speak after the panelists have spoken. So I'll take Panchika my 5 to 10 minutes now. Okay, and just raise a few issues maybe. So, so this book is part of the growing literature on emotions, but more specifically on political emotions, the ramifications on political institutions, but it dissociates itself from the kind of studies that the institutions do, including me. And no, and the reason that he gives is that no, these this scholarship, which is looking at the states in terms of the impact of the right wing populist on the institutions, does not take into account the kind of experiential frames and therefore the emotive majority that gets constituted regardless of what happens within the institution, right? So that seems to be one of the arguments. And I was wondering, and this is a question that I would want us to think about, is no, there was a scholarship earlier in the 80s, which was also raising issues of how, no, issues of how institutions, which are now opaque, ethnic, etc. In the 80s, there was this entire debate raised by Kaviraj, which spoke of the pervasive erosion of legitimacy of institutions. And one of the things that Kaviraj talked about was how the legitimacy of individuals has taken over the legitimacy of institutions, and how socialism, for example, became a clever rhetoric for encompassing a lot of illegalities and evilness that the state actually hides behind this veneer of the glib talk. So the what Ajay is doing in this book is he's substituting legitimacy with another category, and the category is, I think, trust. So he says that there is a way in which political leaders that embody all these emotions, conflicting emotions at that. Prime Minister can at the same time be vulnerable. He can at the same time be khatarnak, and he can at the same time be somebody who's enormously powerful to bring about change. So all these conflicting embodiments in emotions in the body of the leader, and he suggests that this kind of embodiment of all these emotions in the person, in the body of a person, is able to mobilize and galvanize latent emotions. And what puts the structure narrative together is the category of trust. And so it seems that the earlier category of legitimacy is somewhat displaced by the category of trust. And the question I had in this regard is, if we were to think about this, since there are several research students here, in terms of a design of research, and no, we don't go by what is simply the experiential, or in some cases also anecdotal, and think about also how questions of trust are raised in surveys, right? So there's the pitting the two kinds of literature. And I'm thinking about a 2018 survey that was conducted immediately before the elections, by Azim Premji University and CSDS, and that kind of pointed the findings seemed to be that there is not trust in institutions could vary from one institution to the other. There would be institutions considered selfless, like the army or the seat of political authority, like the prime minister. But there are also people like the district collector, the panchayat, which also embody the local levels of differential legitimation and also the client patron relationship. And this could vary across people's caste, religious, or other identities. So there is, and if you think about then, an emotive majority, which could, in any case, if it's galvanized by the right wing, uh, is this is this majority a stable majority? No, is this at all a majority? No, in terms of being again as an institutionalist less than 40% of the other majority. No? So there is how do you look at this dispersal of emotions and in the form of adhering to constitute that majority through the element of trust. And a second related question, and then I'll end with that. No, it has to do with the way in which, and I think this is an important argument, and the category of fungible majority. If fungible, no, the category is um, the moral fungibility. Yes, moral fungibility. And moral fungibility assumes that there are plural emotions that can be at any moment. They can become tangible and be situated and articulated in that context, but they can also be substituted, displaced by other emotions. So that is also an unstable emotion. But you argue that this is something that is important for resisting state power. And what the right does, the right wing does, is that it wants to displace this with a congealed form of emotion. And I was again then wondering whether it's possible to think of going by my position that this emotive majority is perhaps not the majority because there's this other majority which can use tropes like the constitution and the national flag in ways which is very different from the domestication of those tropes, as one saw in the 75th year of the Indian independence, and bringing the Tiranga home was different from its Republican usage in the anti-CAA movements. And I was then wondering whether this other majority and how it vocalizes its resistance is also not an important, and considering that you're also talking about positive emotions and how these need to be reinforced through organizational structures, etc. Whether that the possibility of this other emotion is also somewhere in terms of your explanatory frameworks. So thank you very much for writing this book and giving us this opportunity to discuss some issues which are extremely relevant in the present context, considering what we are discussing in the Karnataka elections. The NRC, for example, is an issue which is highly emotive.
I would now like to call upon Dr. Sanjay Chakravarti. Oh, no. Sorry, I'm sorry. Got off. No. So the format of the discussion is that Dr. Gudavati will speak for 10 to 12 minutes initially, and then each of the discussions will discuss it for 10 to 15 minutes each of the discussion. That's all. Yeah. And in the end, we'll have chairs, remarks. What do I give again? Okay. No. Then again, he'll come back first round, and then.
Which is why you need to cut the chair down to size.
Yeah, so my interest obviously will be more in listening to all of you discussing and the rest of you are here. So let me begin by profusely thanking JNU Academic not only for organizing this good discussion, but for what you have been doing over a period of time at CPS in these very trying times. I think they've really kept the academic culture that we all are, why we fond of JNU the way we all have known it. And I think so. I should thank Supriyo and all his colleagues who have been at work on this. And I would thank Chair and my friends and co-panelists, Vivek, especially Vivek, coming all the way from Ashoka. So it's a long way away. But I know since he's a doctor, he I think is more confident of traveling long distance. Like many of us. So okay, so coming to the book, I think we have had an excellent opening. Both the way Supriyo referred to Wendy Brown, I think that's part of it, which is at the heart of this project. That the old liberal man, so to say, the modern man, is kind of in a crisis. And then I think Anupama has also rightly pointed out to certain very key questions. I think I'll come back to it maybe in Q&A. So I think what I'll do is just draw your attention, since the organizers have given me a very calculated 10 minutes. So what I'll do is just put forth certain theoretical assumptions or theoretical questions at the heart of this project, which are kind of spread across the book. One, this I think I see the work as working at the interface between critical theory and cultural sociology. That kind of questions, my entry point and framing questions, as Anupama has put, though she was trying to frame me more than the questions. So, is one, I think the large theoretical question right at the heart of it is, which has been around in political theory for some time, more so in contemporary critical theory, is there an autonomy to the ethical dimension in social life? That the conventional social theory has always taken ethical premises to be squarely linked to social location and to the material world. But what we seem to be witnessing around is some kind of an upside down, that the ethical and the emotive dimension is demanding certain autonomy, and the way they are being mobilized in the experiential domain, they at least apparently seem that there is a certain kind of an immediate autonomy from the social, that you can't draw it back to caste, class, gender in the way we usually did. And that's, I think, at the heart of the crisis of social theory in general, but the categories of social sciences. So that's one big question. And therefore, the question is also about in terms of the is there a pre-political character to the normative structures that even prior to their being mobilized within social political campaigns and political analysis and so on and so forth, that do normative structures as some kind of an underbelly, underlying in terms of a kind of a medium of intersubjective interactions. Is there a normative structure that one can put and hand on? And is there something that we can analyze in terms of a certain causal outcome? Now, that's where I feel that it's a very elusive kind of a issue in terms of we have got into, you look at the popular campaigns, we have moved to the question of saf niyat, question of intention, the purity of intention. So the entire popular discourse that I go on to narrate in different analyze in different chapters, that therefore one has to get into that domain with an understanding that emotions are not merely experiential, as you know, as Anupama has put it, but I think they're also deeply evaluated. That it is a mode of a language, the way we use language to evaluate in terms of a moral analysis. I think experiences, therefore, emotions are also emotions, and ethics are also, I think, deeply evaluated. That people evaluate on the basis of how certain events, campaigns resonate with their own subjective emotions. And if you take emotions as being evaluative, then I think there has to be some normative structure that can be attached to it, and therefore one can, in a reasonable way, kind of analyze that why right has been getting things right, that the way that they're able to capture popular imagination in spite of all the odds. I mean, simply in spite of all the odds, that there is something that they seem to be getting it right. And that's where I moved to, using Jeffrey Alexander's work in terms of cultural codes, that the argument that myths, mythologies, memory, values, I think play a very decisive role. And this, to my mind, as cultural sociologists have been arguing in as what we have referred to as populism. I think therefore populism is not a deviation of democracy. I think populism is a core constant phenomenon in modern democracies. That it is simply that through a liberal lens when we analyze that populism begins to look like a deviation. That populism begins to look like something that is illiberal. But illiberal is only one characteristic as an outcome of something that is much larger, which is what is the attempt in the book, as Anupama has rightly put, that it's I think we'll have to remove the frame away from legitimacy and even to analyze this illiberal character. It has to be on a much more lateral ground rather than the question of legitimacy and illegitimacy or to the question of authoritarianism and democracy. So that's been one. Third, fourth, obviously, is in terms of the question of the project of majority and project of Hindutva itself as a political ideology, and which is coterminous with the rise of neoliberalism in India. So therefore, there is strong economic material grounding on which this popular mobilization has been working. But what way do these come together? That Hindutva, neoliberal project, and cultural majoritarianism. I think there is no easy understanding. Do they? I mean, there's been so much of literature of Radhika Desai's work, Vivek, you might know. There are a number of scholars who have been engaging with this rather fungible interaction between the neoliberal and the cultural majority. At one level, we see there is a direct fit in terms of the ethics of neoliberalism and the ethics of cultural majority. So I also trace that there is that material root. So it's not that emotions and ethics are completely hanging out there in the air. So there is that root, but there is no direct affinity. That is not that from neoliberalism, some of my left friends perhaps would do, you can immediately read off that there will be a cultural majority in it. That's the same neoliberalism can give rise to different kinds of. So this question of the economic that we have all been vexed with, that why do people turn out to vote to the same government in spite of economy failure? Or why is it that in spite of our unhappiness with neoliberalism, people seem to turn out to vote more and more to more pro-corporate governments? There seems to be something very strange in the way it's happening. So one explanation would obviously be that there is a certain kind of a cultural framing of economic issues. That there are no bare economic issues, but there is cultural framing of economic issues, and therefore economic issues are themselves make sense through a moral cultural field. The question that we have been discussing in terms of what Axel Honneth refers to, that poverty becomes a question of injustice only within a moral discursive field. But by itself, material deprivation is not a question of justice. But this cultural framing of the economic is again, you have a thick version of it that where the cultural produces certain moral constraints to the economic questions of accumulation and deprivation, or that the cultural actually trumps economic issues. So there is, I think, a thick claim and there is also a thin claim. And I try to examine both, that there are times in which the people seem to be completely unmindful of the economic deprivation. There are times in which people give you a moral reasoning as to why deprivation might be good or may not be of an immediate relevance. There are other larger issues of religiosity, culture, civilization, so on. So there are both these thick and thin kind of claims. And therefore, I think there is nothing in neoliberalism that would immediately throw up. So in that, and Phillips has argued that equality by and large is out of picture in terms of modern politics and political mobilization. And that has been taken over by various other micro forms of mobilization. Could be contextual mobilization, could be relative mobility. There are other categories one can invoke in terms of how to make sense of this misfit between economic deprivation and cultural ways of understanding that economic deprivation. That's where also in my previous work I have drawn on David Goodhart's work on populism, where he has argued that while even as neoliberalism is pushing deeper economic inequalities and class indeed is working, that class is not the central mobilizational category. That instead he argues categories of somewheres and anywheres. That somewheres are those who are provincially, territorially located with a sense of belonging, and anywheres are rest of us uprooted, which we would like to dignify as being cosmopolitan. Basically, we are uprooted, but we are cosmopolitan way we are uprooted. So this sense of belonging, I think, has suddenly become a very key category in terms of the current mobilization. Therefore, if you look at their entire strategy of beginning with religion, reinterpreting religion in terms of culture and community, reinterpreting culture and community as civilization. This civilizational state discourse that has come globally, I think, has something to do with this sense of uprootedness, I think, which we have been discussing since Nietzsche to Heidegger, and everyone has discussed this crisis of modernity that it makes us feel deeply uprooted. And therefore, I think Wright's big success has been that it has given us a sense of belonging, and that has to be taken. That people, I think, do it in a territorial sense, in a cultural sense, in terms of a continuity of history. There could various ways where one can approach this idea of what this sense of belonging would mean. And finally, in terms of study of emotions, I think the other big challenge is that where much of our social science methodology is geared towards uh, focusing on particular variables in terms of zeroing on our universe. Uh, I think emotions can't simply be studied in that sense. That they are neither they work exclusively in the micro contextual way, nor they are macro. I think you need that big picture. So it is more of a deductive mode one has to. That there is a big picture in which they work. One needs to understand the big context why people are responding the way they actually do, and then zero into particular micro context to actually see that how that fructifies, that big picture, how does that fructify. So it can, again, as I said, it can happen in multiple ways. If you read the chapter on the differentiation I make between anger and hatred, for instance, that anger, as Martha Nussbaum has argued, can be a productive emotion. Similarly, Rainer Foss, critical theorist, argues that conflict itself can be very productive because conflict itself can generate trust. Like class conflict is meant to generate trust within a given class. So it's not that conflict always undermines trust. To the point Anupama was raising, part of my answer would be that therefore I think there are new ways in which trust is being generated. It is not the conventionally binary mode in which we have understood trust as merely in terms of non-conflictual collective. I do not know how Wright gets it right, but I think they have a sense of this, that conflict does not necessarily mean undermining trust. So the way they can have a normative universal claim to a normative universal discourse at one level of civilization, common Hindu, sabka saath, sabka vikas, and at other end they have this highly conflictual kind of mobilization between subcastes, between sects within Muslims. Is I mean politically ominous, but I think for a political theorist it's a very fertile field for them. How do these things actually go together? Obviously, this is not working in the conventional sense in which we understand these categories of trust and collective in social theory. Therefore, I think there is a need for us to understand in terms of these new dialectics, that the way that, for instance, to put it at a thumb level, it could be that greater social fragmentation is leading to greater trust. So if one way to make a formulation of this kind, then I think one would have said something about how this is being generated, that why greater social fragmentation in terms of subcaste. Could it be vulnerability? Could that be a category that, Prashant, you are fond of, that we are all vulnerable, and therefore is it that vulnerability makes us dependent, and therefore the social character of this trust is something very different from what it looks from an external gaze. Finally, I want to move on to the question of betrayal, question of self. I think, see, these are some of the categories I found useful to at least offer a partial explanation in terms of where we are getting at, and not in the traditional sense that political scientists have used. For instance, social capital, the way it uses trust, I think, is not the way trust is really working in the bridging, bonding capital kind of thing that we have seen, that if there is local bonding, then there is better bridging capital with other religions. It's simply not the way things are working. That there more social fragmentation internally is leading to more external. That could be vulnerability, that from one angle it looks like we are breaking away from the old patron-client relation. From another angle, it looks like we are actually ending up with a more charitable kind of state. That there's more patronage, there is more. So it is like what Adorno talked about, that the phenomenon of King Kong and suburban barber. That you have both the phenomenon instituted, personified in the same individual, and therefore suddenly individuals, gestures, personalities have come to the fore. And well, I have a lot more to say, but I think I've run out of my time, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, with this, I would now call upon Dr. Santosh Chakravarti.
Thank you, JNU academics, and thanks all of you for coming in this very inclement weather to hear us. I think Anupama and then Ajay has already given me enough sort of thought. I've just read the book, the whole book with great interest. And I'll just make 2 or 3 points, which is relevant to the points that have already been made. First thing is about what I find interesting in Ajay's idea of what he called populism. On one hand, there is a very strong, as in as many as other, very strong interest in the real. That is to say, to push ourselves away from the liberal kind of woolly sensibility from which we will not cross. And he has a very strong sense of confronting. Now that is very, very welcome, I think. So when you're confronting and particularly confronting difficult questions, you have a very strong sense of the real, where you can keep aside metaphysical questions, or questions of moralism, and come to what he calls, a certain kind of illiberal. So it's not an easy terrain to go, but as we can understand, we are not left with this difficult task. We cannot skirt anymore, right? We have, and he does that. So on one hand, you have that strength, but the issue is, simultaneously, and I think it's a productive tension in Ajay's book. Simultaneously, what he says, he has a very strong interest in, as I find, a very prior normative. I mean, normative is possibly not the word, but prior deep interest in the ethical. Now, if you have that sensibility that and that ethical undercuts his idea of the real. He constantly he's sort of trying to balance between how much to go with the real, and then sort of bring the ethical not as a scaffolding, but always and skirting the humanist liberal framework simultaneously. So I'll come to the question of self as I saw it and how he understands that. So, for example, as I said, he has complicated certain terms, very polar opposite terms, emotionally, a strong, darker emotion, so to say, right? So fear and anxiety as a pair, or consent and fear as a pair, or what he said right now, anger and hatred. Now he says, that anger, as he said right now, anger is a very productive thing, and it can have radical, positive dimensions. Whereas hatred is a negative; it does not have anywhere to go. Reaches a dead end, and therefore it has a right-wing tendency. Now, to that extent, he's right. But after a few lines, and I think that confusion that all of us have, and Ajay also has, I think he says, but how will I distinguish? At some point it seems anger is flowing into hatred and hatred is flowing back into anger. So it's very difficult to distinguish where exactly one sees oneself as angry, which is taking us towards some progressive kind of a politics, or whatever you call, central left variations of that, and that changes into retribution, changes into vengefulness, and so distinguishing is impossible. So on what basis I'll make this distinction between what is right wing and what is left wing, right? I mean, this is a very difficult question, and I'm not speaking from a centrist point of view. I'm talking from a real difficulty where ethics and realism sort of clashes. It seems to me, that's the first very, very interesting thing that I saw. Now that means, he could have taken a line with vices. The human vices, when the liberal takes human vices, and Judith Scudder is a great example, where she talks about, apart from cruelty, she takes on various other possibilities into sort of consideration, misanthropy, betrayal, snobbery, hypocrisy, and she goes a long way with it, and says liberals have to confront these things. I mean, that's the best example. In the Kantian framework, we can have that scholar kind of writing. But scholar is still working within a rationalist, deliberative sort of normative framework. She's not going out of that. She's not moving out into the illiberal. I mean, she won't go there. So now, on the other hand, if you move with political realism away from the liberal framework, say if you go back to Machiavelli and Hobbes and Thucydides and Schmidt and Lenin, even I would say, if you move within that framework, you can move into writings of Runciman or or others, where questions of mendacity or hypocrisy has been taken in realist terms. So there's no question of ethics there. There's a question of ethics from a realist point of view, where you cannot have the way you think that the ethical is has a I can skirt the liberal humanist framework and move into some other populist Gandhian sort of thing, and I'll come to that later. Now, that is first point that I want to make. And I'll come back to how I see his ethics. The second point I think which is important is, and his book has given me a sort of a window to get into this very difficult question: what exactly is right wing? Now, this is a very, very difficult question, and in today's context, the common sense would be, and the common sense is right. All of us are being part of that and suffering and thinking about that, etc., etc. Is that right means religious, which is not untrue, which is true, but right-wing tendency, as you will understand from your political sort of acumen, is fundamentally to do more with a sense of security rather than freedom, right? That is the classic distinction that Hobbes makes, or means to a right wing. I would think, classical right wing tendencies, and there are several right wing ideas, is to go to a question of order, to go to a question of hierarchy, go to a question of a certain kind of, sensibility where mutual conditions of cooperation are already decided, right? So what you are conserving, or you conserve memory, for example. What when we call someone a conservative, what are you conserving actually? Now you're conserving religion, but you're also conserving certain other things. And I say this, I begin with this to say that a right winger is what we see, makes a very sharp distinction, as I see now, between intellect and feeling. Now, this sharp distinction, what T.S. Eliot used to call dissociation of sensibility, I'm a student of literature, so I can see that, if you make this very sharp distinction between intellect and feeling, as it is happening now, and I think it's a great revenge of 20th century, which was more about, objectivity and, and moving away from emotions. And then we have a backlash now in 21st century, where this question of the subjective has made a great return, where you see that this question of sharply dividing intellect and feeling will have repercussions. In the sense, it's not about keeping intellect aside. That intellect is a wrong term, a bad term across political spectrum. It's not just a religious right, which is, of course, it has a power to it, so it has other sort of ramifications because it has power. But that intellect is something that has nothing to do with our lives. Is a kind of, that I would call a very strong right-wing fascist tendency across political spectrum, which is that our culture is defined by this in various ways, right? And that is one. So there you make a distinction between intellect and feeling. And then suppose I keep intellect aside for the time being and take emotion seriously, right? As a student of literature, we have always done that, and as anyone, as student of life, all of us are. How can we do without emotions? There's nothing new. That this affective turn that we have seen so many turns. It's not that people before affective turn were not emotional, or after affective turn people won't be emotional. People will be emotional. Now, why is this now in vogue? Why is this affect in the vogue? Now, if I take this idea of affect seriously, as many of you know, I don't have to name names, that there's again, there are various strands in this affect studies these days, and if you bring affect studies and political theory together, then you can either take affect as a behavioral notion of feeling, where feeling can be connected with a certain kind of sociability and so on, or you can take them in other directions, as Deleuzian, or coming from Spinoza, actually going back to affect as a force field, where it is pre-political, it has other kind of possibilities, etc., which is a different kind of. So there are various ways where affect and emotion may not be the same, and there are several layers within which we have to understand where exactly where we are going. Now, so vitalism, for example, is a great affective possibility, but which is not about subjective feeling at all, right? So that means where I'm actually leading to is that there is a turn away from critique. Right? There is a wholesale turn away from the notion of critique, which has been we taken for granted, critique, critical study, etc. Now we cannot take that for granted anymore. Right? That means that it has ramifications in the sense that what we have is, at the risk of slightly simplifying, what we have a culture of repairing. Now, there's a great book has come, which is Rules of Repair, or there are many other, writing that is coming up where there is a sense of solidarity, which is a kind of solidarity tourism, if you like, which is not exactly the kind of, powerful, deep kind of, political solidarities of cooperation that is, but solidarity tourism of the kind that we see where the question is, why, if these kind of things are happening, how has anti-hegemonic drive becomes associated with feeling as a practice and the rejection of historicism and the rejection of ideology critique? When did this happen? That there's a very sharp distinction that I'll remove historicism and ideology critique and move into this domain wholesale, right? When can we not historicize feeling and take feeling as if it is outside of our historical sort of possibilities, and therefore we cannot critique feeling, right? So that I think is a very interesting turn that we have to understand. If we are doing that, then we are moving into a registers of absolution, repair, reconciliation, remediation. This seems to be very strong bourgeois terms to me, on the face of it. Seems to be absolutely bourgeois terms. And I'm not taking any coming from any particular position. I'm saying this because my sense is that on one hand, and go back to the question of right, classical ideas of the idea of the feudal right, landowning, ideas of the right, which is based on tradition, prejudice, memory, etc., where the hierarchy is more to do with the kind of what we see, what Ajay's books, book actually brings up very strongly, I think, as a techno-feudal kind of a situation, right? Technologically progressive, but backward, forward, regressive, progressive kind of thing. On the other hand, what we know as other right, that is to say, fiscal right, individualistic right, that is connected with individualism, which is a much more modern concept, is, and one would think it would go back to the person who has written Wealth of Nations, but who has before Wealth of Nations, 20 years before, he has written this whole great treatise called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, someone who is writing Theory of Moral Sentiments and also writing Wealth of Nations, we should understand, and he has given us this term, sympathy, very strongly in 18th century, and that sympathy means it's whereby individuals can come together, not in the way we understand left ideas of solidarity, but other forms of sociability, by which individuals will come together and therefore give a sort of a ethical sort of valorization of the market. Right? This ethicalizing of the market is what Adam Smith has done by giving us this moral sentiment. This idea of empathy now, which has bypassed the notion of critique altogether, wholesale. I mean, we should be careful about how we use, the idea of empathy, whether there are different kinds of right-wing tendencies in us. I'm talking, from which vantage point am I talking today about intellect and feeling, and what my position is something that has to be ascertained before I mount a critique very strongly, right? So this idea of the right, I think, is very interesting to open up, apart from religious idea of the right, the category of right itself, right? Do I have 5 more minutes? Yeah. Okay. I'll just sum up. 2 more things about Ajay's book. Coming back to what Ajay is saying, he has some very interesting. Apart from critiquing the right, he has very strong critique of the internal critique in the book. Very strongly, I think, several points. Internal critique of what we would usually call the center left or liberal possibilities. Generally, now these distinctions are often very fuzzy. Used to be very strong battles before all of us know. So now, one is that the constitutional morality is appropriated selectively by people who do not know how to use law, for example, whether they should go with law or go against law. Put simply, there are scholars who are internally critiquing who are ostracized, by their own people, right? There is silence. There is, moralistic appeal against victimizing the victim. These are Ajay's terms, and I largely agree with them. There are also he wants to learn from the right. This is a great virtue. I think a difficult thing, not an easy thing to do. That right has done, by religious right, in this case, more accessible idea of right. That right has done various kind of humanitarian acts. It understands, it connects, communicates. There's the idea of collective living, etc. Why do we see that famous left arrogance, so to say, what has it led to, this is not a self-flagellation. I don't see it's in the flagellating ourselves that we have been arrogant, therefore tomorrow will be very nice and good. No, that is not his line. He's not talking, his book is not about nicety. Not at all, as you know. It's anything but nicety. So something else is happening. So there's a kind of, all these things are critiqued. But after the critiques, there are other critics also. Also, why identities cannot come together. That's a strong, thread in his book, and it remains refracted, etc. Then finally, Ajay has hopes. Unlike me, who is congenitally pessimistic. I think I'm very happy that he has given us some scope for some breathing space, to move away from our general tendency of being a pessimist. Is that and his hope relies on this question of connecting what he calls this third radical upsurge after 1947 and then after Mandal, and then there's a third radical upsurge, and that will happen at some point. And he realizes, as we know, he's very interested, all of you know, he's interested in recognition. He mentioned Axel on it today also. His idea in third generation Frankfurt School is his interest in frontal move again and again. Now, my simple question is that I'm with Ajay as far as JNU is concerned, but I slightly differ from him on the question of populism, in the idea of left populism, that is to say, where I would want how frontal move kind of agnostic politics, frontal move has a very powerful interest in agnosticism, can be connected with ethics of the kind, Gandhian kind or other kinds that Ajay, sort of likes and loves, and tries to talk about trust and so on, Frontal move's trajectory seems to be a populism which is not exactly Ajay's kind of ethics, maybe something else. That is what I felt, a little bit of that. Now, so I'll just end with two small points. I'm more or less done with what I wanted to say. Two small points I felt when he's talking about emotions. He's talking about, as I said, darker emotions, But if one want to look at right, one can also look at, lighter emotions. That is just a humor, right? Wit. Now, why is there a wholesale lack of witty, humor, and why has fun come down to our sense of fun has come down to stand-up comedies of a kind, or exchanging memes of a particular kind. And I'm not taking a position from pedestal. I'm not saying that these are good or bad. I'm saying just to study what is the basis of this lighter emotion? How does right use lighter emotion? How does a liberal use a lighter emotions, or whatever political spectrum you are, in. The other thing last point that I want to make is that Ajay's book has a very, very strong interest in, because this book is about India, and in the local very strongly, and I mean, he's an academic activist, and has a long trajectory of actual sort of interest in politics and so on. You mentioned Balagopal. Remember our days in Bangalore. Now I felt the book is slightly short of international sort of, or maybe Ajay can tell us more about how the Indians who are traveling, the migrants, or the or people who are diaspora who are traveling, because the right spends money here and it has connection. So India is not isolated and so on. If you want to think about the local very deeply, whether the idea of India is also can be connected with what's happening with India around the world. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of JNU Academic and Professor Gudavarthi, I think, who has just stepped out, for giving me the opportunity to come here and participate in this discussion with such a distinguished panel. I'm thrilled to be here at JNU. Even though I was not fortunate enough to be educated here, I've long admired JNU from a distance, not only for its beautiful campus and the learned faculty, but above all for its diverse, bright, and politically aware student body. That's why it's a real honor to be here today. Let me begin my comment on Professor Gudavarthi's book, Politics, Ethics, and Emotions in New India. And let me first say that I thoroughly enjoyed. I wonder if I should wait for him.
Yeah.
Okay. I would like him to respond to some of these. Good to have you back, Mr. Guruvarti. I was just beginning my critical comment on your book. So let me just begin by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. The book, as you all know, consists for the most part in a series of reflections on an assortment of topics that have dominated national politics since Mr. Modi's re-election in 2019. Taken together, the essays provide an illuminating commentary on the immediate prehistory of the present political moment and the events and developments that have led us here. In an age which has seen an unprecedented acceleration of the news cycle, the essays in the book give us pause and invite us to take a closer look at the political events which the news media continuously and rapidly fits through. At a time when news television presents politics as a drama of sorts, made up of a series of events that have been stripped of their context, the reflections contained in the book force us to do what the news media systematically discourages us from doing, which is delving deeper into the larger issues underlying the events presented to us. In that sense, this book represents a very timely intervention. My comment shall, for the most part, focus on two terms in the title, politics and emotions. I shall touch upon the third term, ethics, only briefly towards the end, more by way of asking a question than as a comment. But let me at the very outset emphasize my agreement with what I take to be the basic premise of the book, that in order to understand what has happened in Indian politics in recent years, and I guess Professor Guruvarti would say politics more generally around the world, but especially in India with the rise of the BJP under Narendra Modi, that we need to pay attention especially to something that theorists of politics, especially democratic politics, have long neglected, namely emotions and the role that they play in politics. Now, it does not take any special powers of discernment to see that emotions have always played a role, a central role in politics. But what is perfectly evident to almost anyone who participates in politics seems to have been curiously lost for the most part on political theorists, especially within the liberal fold. So if one reads the preeminent liberal theorists of democracy since World War II, one could be forgiven for thinking that emotions have no role whatsoever to play in democratic politics. So emotions certainly have no place in Rawls's well-ordered society, nor do they belong in a deliberative democracy of the sort that Habermas envisions, in which public reason as realized in rational deliberation within the public sphere is supposed to be supreme. Even Hannah Arendt, who is altogether more original thinker than Rawls and Habermas, banishes emotions from the public realm in which politics proceeds. In fact, the only time that emotions make an appearance in her writings is when describing the worst excesses of political revolutions. When emotions appear in public and become efficacious in politics, according to Arendt, bad things tend to happen. Against the background of this large and puzzling lacuna in the literature, the reasons for which are themselves interesting, and I would be happy to talk about them during discussion, a work which foregrounds the role of emotions in democratic politics is especially welcome. It contributes to a growing body of literature on the role of emotions in politics, which now includes scholars of a more liberal persuasion like Martha Nussbaum as well, who have in recent years sought to soften liberalism's traditional hostility towards political emotions. Unlike Nussbaum, however, Professor Guruvarti seems more interested in the role played by negative emotions in politics. And it is here that his commentary is at its most insightful. The rise of the BJP under Narendra Modi, Guruvarti argues, has been fueled by a set of misdirected emotions, which Mr. Modi has managed to exploit for his own advantage. In Guruvarti's words, and I quote, anger born out of legitimate aspirations got expressed as intolerance, which the current political leadership systematically attempted to convert into a system of hatred. Legitimate anger became illegitimate tolerance, and well founded aspirations were converted into ill conceived hatred. The distinction drawn here between the sort of hatred that has fueled the BJP's rise and the justified, indignant anger of the oppressed in India, for example, the Dalit and Bahujan groups, I think is a crucial one. It allows us to see what is wrong with those accounts which explain Narendra Modi's rise by taking recourse to the rather vague idea of an age of anger. If Modi's rise has been fueled by a wave of hatred, it is kept in place, Guruvarthi argues, by a mechanism of delegating guilt and shame, wherein a few individuals get their hands dirty on behalf of the larger affective community of hatred by periodically perpetrating violence on individuals from minority groups in the form of humiliation, beating, and lynching. If I have a complaint about Guruvarthi's otherwise insightful analysis of political emotions, it is that it does not reflect sufficiently on the concept of emotion itself. Although the book abounds with concrete examples of how emotions operate in politics, I found I was wishing that there would be more theoretical reflection on emotion itself. In one of the few passages where he does come close to defining emotion, Guruvarthi claims that emotions are something that connect two planes of pragmatism and normativity. I quote, morality is rigid, hierarchical, and sanitized, and operates in empty time. Ethics are evaluative and enable making sense of everyday life and essentially remain open to correction and revision. This process is therefore, by its very nature, closely related to pragmatic working that does not eschew normative meaning making of life, and emotions connect the two planes of pragmatism and normativity. Emotions become the basis of both normativity and justifications for pragmatic choices. I think here Professor Guruvarthi's opening remarks were actually quite helpful because he seems to espouse the view of emotions that regards them as a kind of evaluations of sorts. And here I wonder how your view of emotions would then differ from the kind of neo-Stoic view of emotions that say Nussbaum puts forward. Nussbaum famously, or infamously, depending on what intellectual school you belong to, argues that emotions are judgments of sorts. They're eudaimonistic in the sense that they have implicit within them a vision of the good of man. So if I would like to kind of push Professor Guruvarthi to reflect a bit more about the differences between your understanding of emotions and Nussbaum's. I would also, I think, like to know more about this distinction between morality and ethics that you draw. Because it seems that what you refer to by morality here is kind of Kantian, in the sense that, as Kant thought that morality is about following the dictates of one's reasons. What's interesting is that what you call ethics here seem to be closer to what the British sentimentalists call propriety. Right? And so I was wondering, how you would situate your understanding of ethics, because it seems that you use the word ethics in a kind of positive connotation. How would you, place yourself within this disagreement in moral philosophy? And here, I think I would like to register another point of dissatisfaction. Guruvarthi's analysis moves exclusively within the conceptual vocabulary of emotion sentiment borrowed from European languages. But the fact remains that the Indian political vernacular, by which I mean the practical language of politics employed by the vast majority of the people who actually participate in democratic politics in India, right, the political vernacular, does not talk in the language of emotion, but moves within an entirely different conceptual vocabulary, in which the central concept is not emotion, but bhav or bhavana. And if you read, the literature that I like very much, this is the literature on Indian philosophical aesthetics, the Rasa tradition, there is a body of thinking about bhav and bhavana, which is at least, I think, 1500 years old. And we have the concept of bhavana developed in two very different schools of Indian philosophy. There is not only the Rasa philosophy, but also the Mimamsaka, the Vedic hermeneutic philosophers, who developed bhavana as a hermeneutic theory to make sense of how the readers or the hearers of the Vedas are impelled to act on the injunctions of the Vedas. And interestingly, this theory is then taken up by Rasa theorists in Kashmir, people like Patanaika, who use this new understanding of bhavana to build a theory of aesthetics. Um, so, and I want to emphasize that this is not merely a terminological quibble, uh, because I think it's easy to assume that the concept of emotion and the concept of bhava will are congruent, neatly map onto each other. But I think that's a mistake. Just to point out one non-convergence, the concept of bhavana has connotations of intention, which are altogether missing from the concept of emotion. And not just that, I think the emotional palette, the emotional register of Indian society also differs, I wouldn't say significantly, but significantly enough to, for us to actually pay attention to, these divergences. To give you another example, the concept of tragic, so central to aesthetics in the West, has no exact counterpart in the Indian languages. The concept of karuna, right? So when we say that Ramayana is organized around karuna rasa, it's not tragic. There are significant differences, and I think those differences become significant, especially when we are thinking about emotions in Indian politics. Just to push my theoretical agenda just a little more, I tend to think that if there's framework that's more suited to analyzing political emotions in contemporary India is furnished by a theory of drama. And I think what's interesting about your analysis of political emotions is that it brings out something which the Rasa theorists would completely agree with. Because one of the main concepts in Rasa theory is something called sadharanikaran. They say that emotions in real life are individuated, particularized, but emotions in drama are generalized, they are communalized. And it seems that what you are referring to when you talk about an emotive majority or an affective community is the workings of sadharanikaran of emotions in politics. So I think that is another framework which can lend itself very easily to the things that you're trying to analyze. What's interesting about Professor Guduvarthi's analysis is that although he does not foreground drama as a frame of analysis, that frame is nonetheless present in this work. Because wherever, if you take any theory of drama, the theorists of drama would tell you that wherever there are emotions, there is a narrative and there is a persona. So we must think of emotions always within this frame. At least the Rasa theorists would say.
Feminists.
Uh, um, and I think Professor Gudavarthi does, in his analysis, also he does bring up narratives. And one of the high points of the book is his analysis of political narratives. And here, I want to take a small issue with your analysis of political narratives because it seems that you critique the political narratives of the sort that Mr. Modi weaves for the fact that they are not factually correct. Factual accuracy. Here's a typical example. Most of Modi's governance appears reduced to managing perception by generating controlled narratives, mostly fictitious and based on misplaced facts. Here's another one. Digital images have made two things distinctly possible. One, communication without dialogue, and two, narratives without facts. By interpolating an imagined reality These political narratives, it seems, seek to do away with facts altogether. But here, I must register another point of disagreement, or rather 2 points. First, I think that when it comes to political narratives, it is a bit misleading to counterpose facts to imagined reality. I think it's a rather narrow understanding of political discourse that makes it out to be a matter of accurately repeating facts. But the fact is that politics, especially democratic politics, always involves the work of the imagination. It is the task of leaders and parties to persuade voters by presenting to them a vision, an imagined future state of affairs that they can believe in. It's a different matter that political theory seems to be blind to this imaginative aspect of democratic politics. But the fact is that if you evacuate this imaginative aspect of democratic politics, you degrade politics. Factual accuracy is therefore neither the only possible criteria for evaluating political narratives, nor is it even the most important one, at least in my view. And here I think, once again, I would like to draw a distinction. I think in English, when we talk about that something is a work of imagination, the connotation is, oh, it's mere imaginary. It's mere imagination. It's something less than real. I think in the Indian languages, the concept of kalpana, right, has a connotation of construction. And I think the connotation there is that whatever is kalpit, whatever is the work of the imagination can also be more than real. Right? So I think any understanding of political narratives in democratic theory must start out with an acknowledgement of this kind of imaginative dimension of politics. And the fact that actually democratic politics, especially in India, draws its principal elements from the world of drama, it seems. Let me just end by saying one thing about populism, because I think it came up, and it would be a pity without to not say anything on it. I think Professor Gudavarthi raised a very interesting question. He asked if populism is an integral part of democracy, and whether we should not think, whether we should not treat populism as an integral part of democracy. In my own work, I look at populism as a kind of non-Western shadow cast by the self-image of liberal democracy. The self-image of liberal democracy was one in which rational opinion would rule, right? Where emotions have no place. So if you read someone like Habermas, democratic politics seems to be like an academic seminar. And in contrast to this self-image of liberal democracy, they said that look, politics in places like Latin America and the non-West, it's full of these leaders, it's full of these emotions, and that to describe that they use populism. So it seems like the liberal self-image of democracy and populism are kind of flip sides of each other. After the rise of right-wing leaders in Europe and Trump in the US, liberal theorists, started arguing that the specter of populism, which was limited to the margins of the West until now, had come to haunt Western societies. But this seems to me like heaping mistake over mistake, because the original mistake consisted in not acknowledging the fact that politics is actually not an academic seminar. Right? Emotions, imagination, drama are integral parts of politics. So I wonder if I could rephrase Professor Gudavarthi's point and say that, perhaps what we need to acknowledge is not that populism was an integral part of democracy, but rather we should acknowledge a major blind spot of liberal democratic theory. It's inattention to the fact that imagination and emotions are constitutive of the democratic practice. Okay. Let me sum up my response by re-emphasizing the great virtue of Professor Gudavarthi's book, that it foregrounds the role of emotions in politics, an issue that political theory does not ordinarily pay attention to, and provides a much needed reflection on the events and developments that have landed us where we are today. Thank you.
Anything is left. So, these are brilliant presentations and extremely thought through and systematically organized. So, I'm not going to try to pitch something, up to that uh, sort of frequency at all. And I'll take advantage of the fact that I've known Ajay. I've seen him, kind of writing book after book. He's extremely prolific, which led me once to wonder whether he clones himself. There are several Ajays at the same time. So, and I do think this book actually kind of confirms, part of my suspicion. Because, before I get there, let me compliment Ajay for what all the speakers, including the chair, have already said, which is that Ajay has broken new ground with this kind of work. And we don't really look at the role of emotions as a central kind of problematic at a macro uh, sort of level in political theory, and he is going there, undaunted, so to speak, and making a very, very interesting and sophisticated coupling with the question of ethics and everyday ethics in this case. And to therefore congratulate Ajay for being, he's always been provocative, as you know, and those of you who did do his classes, he's always been extremely provocative, and that shows up in his kind of work and scholarship. So this, I take this book in some sense to be that sort of a provocation to others doing political science, political theory, and other branches of humanities, that how do we look at this question of emotion with regard to populism, but again at a wider sort of level as well in political theory, from the standpoint of political theory and from the standpoint of ethics and morality. Now, this, I think, this tendency to provoke, on the one hand, which is more frequently kind of witnessed, and there is this other kind of tendency to kind of tie up the loose ends and present a kind of structure that is more or less neat, though it has kind of messy angularities here and there, but it's a kind of tendency to offer a resolution to the puzzle that he is placing. This has led to, it could be possible perhaps to read this book as being written by parts by a provocative Ajay, who's also very pragmatic in identifying, and this resonates with some of the remarks that were being made before, where he is actually, in Prashanto's words, is approaching the real. He's sticking to the real in terms of the actually existing on the ground kind of real. And there's also, I mean, I'm surprised to discover a normative Ajay at the same time, who's trying to offer a certain resolution, who's trying to kind of offer a new version of what is to be done by the left and the liberal, faced with this conundrum of the deployment of emotions in politics. Um, Now, this of course raises a question which has come in the kind of comments of the previous speakers, is that um, it's surprising then to see that he kind of takes his cues, more frequently from liberal philosophers who are, of course, challenging the established tenets and directions of liberalism, but Anne Phillips, Martha Nussbaum, and so on, and not, let's say, thinkers or philosophers who one would place, let us say, outside the pale of liberalism at some level. Let's say somebody like Schmidt, or somebody like Walter Benjamin, so on and so forth. I thought that that is quite interesting, and that is one of my question at a thematic level. That I was wondering, why did you not go towards something like psychoanalysis? Because so much of what you're dealing with has to do with psychology. You know, you talk about it as cultural sociology, but there is a lot of it which I read as basically psychology. And I was wondering that why don't you engage with psychoanalysis, which also offers. I'm going for a different category than what Vivek just said. I mean, in his scholarly exposition. And I was thinking of fantasy and the role of fantasy in politics and the capacity for generating fantasies as, among other things, managing distrust. Since the central question of Ajay seems to be that of how is the right wing regime managing to constantly create trust. So one of its ways is to kind of managing distrust. So I see it also as slightly differently, not so much as a trust in a pure sense of the term, but a kind of management of distrust through various means, including force, extreme force, and often illegitimate use of force. Which so takes me back to a point that Anupama was making, is how how do we really kind of understand the majority that Ajay refers to as the emotive majority, kind of laying out the making of an emotive majority in this book. But are we speaking about a numerical majority? Are we speaking about a majority who's really very emotional, when they are thinking about politics or when they're taking part in politics? Or are we talking about, at a more basic empirical level, uh, perhaps empirically, a minority which is very belligerent, which is performing a constant kind of belligerence and aggression, and therefore, managing to overwhelm our visual field or our field of perception, what we can see and what we can say, simultaneously with a kind of suppression and silencing of the other majority that Anupama was talking about, which has been erupting, constantly for the last few years, endlessly. Farmers' protests, we talked about Shaheen Bagh, we talked about energy. There's been endless kind of eruptions of this type, but which do not seem to capture our kind of imagination so much or register on us with so much of force. Um, so I would like Ajay to kind of unpack this idea of emotive majority much more in terms of its constituent elements and what lies behind this emotive majority and what does it leave outside its frame of emotive in some sense. The other question that was coming to my mind, that is now it's my turn to provoke Ajay. Is Ajay suggesting somewhere, or Professor Buddhavarti suggesting somewhere, that there is a deep grammar to the performance of politics at this particular democratic juncture? You know, we cannot really make sense of all the political gestures, utterances, and speeches by simply merely looking at the surface, what is happening. But we really need to kind of plumb the depth, go under, and understand a set of rules which are internally consistent and are at play. Now, this can be perhaps also related to what Vivek was saying at one point of time with the Krishna Prasad theory and the idea of bhavna in some sense, which also suggested to me something like a deep grammar, even if you didn't use these words. Is Ajay meaning something of a similar kind? And if that is the case, then wouldn't that require him to step outside the resources offered by liberal theory itself? Since he's critiquing liberal theory, I take it to be an internal critique. Um, and these are kind of disparate comments. They are not in a very organized, thought through order in which the other speakers were making their presentation. Um, One of the questions that Ajay was also raising here at the point at which he was presenting is, uh, I would like to pick on two of those. One is, um, where does cultural nationalism and neoliberalism come together, or cultural majoritarianism and neoliberalism come together? Because so much of each of these constellations could be seen as antithetical or seen in tension with each other. Well, one of the things that we can perhaps remember from populist experiments in Latin America, among other contexts, is that the more radical steps towards neoliberalism, let us say something like the dilution of labor laws, very, very banal kind of things like that, but which have huge implications, cannot be undertaken without an authoritarian ambience, without having prior established a kind of authoritarian atmosphere. You cannot actually undertake these kind of moves, these kind of steps. So there is a way in which more raw, and this is I can be charged for doing a reductionist Marxist logic here, but nevertheless, let me make the point that the more raw and radical steps for neoliberal mode of accumulation require a kind of cranking down of the democratic element in society and creating a certain consensus for authoritarian measures, for the moral superiority of extremely authoritarian kind of measures, executive measures, overriding institutions, so on and so forth. Part of which we had seen, as Anupama was referring to, in the emergency during the emergency period. Part of this drama had already unfolded itself back then. So I was it made me really think that if I'm broadly not off the mark, that this is at least one of the ways in which culture and economy can come together. This is at least one of the ways in which a majoritarian cultural majoritarianism and neoliberalization can form a pact, come to have a contract, and this is probably what informs much of crony capitalism that we witness with this. Oh, thanks. Yeah, no, it's a relief actually. I'm really kind of searching for profound points now. Um, so, is the right really getting things right? This is an assumption that Ajay makes in the book, that the right is getting things right and the liberals and the left are getting things wrong. Okay. I'm not entirely convinced about it. I'm willing to go along with the assumption that the liberals and lefts have been getting various things wrong, especially the liberals, I think. I'm not too sure whether the right is getting things right is again a pragmatic Ajay, looking at things. If the right had been getting things right, there wouldn't have been so much of a need for sheer force, for unleashing sheer force and sheer violence to this extent, because then there would have been hegemony, to use an old term. And the term comes to me because, among other things, this, absolutely fantastic work and provocative work by Ajay reminded me of an old classic essay by Stuart Hall on thinking through Gramsci, the Thatcherite period, and beginning to point out what were the things that the British Labour had misunderstood about the rise of Thatcher and the Conservative Party in Britain. And among other things, Stuart Hall was making one very fundamental, basic kind of point, which is that this is a new conservative party. I think among the things that the liberals and the left has been getting wrong is precisely the fact that this is a new right wing that we are looking at. This is not a continuation of the old right wing. And one of the things it can do is to deploy, one element that Ajay has mined in his book, emotions, manipulating them expertly, and the other is the use of sophisticated technology and information systems to kind of complementary in complementary kind of ways. So to kind of draw close to this sort of disparate points, I would just say that again, I would put a question mark against the question of whether the right is really able to create a sense of belonging. Because if you are able to create a sense of belonging for a significant number of people, then you don't really need to forcibly silence a whole lot of people who are voicing that they don't belong to this imagination that you have to offer them. So I'll take my pause. Thank you very
Four. Okay, yeah. So we now have the response project. So how much time that we have
Yeah.
to respond? 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
much. You can get the other Ajay.
Now that
It's 12
which is now taking rest actually. Well, this is like an impossible task to respond to all of it, but I think I'll. Okay, so I'll respond to the points I think I should be responding, not to the point that you are expecting me to respond. Because there are great amount, I think we all agree on the point that there is something to be rethought, and understandably, we don't really agree what that is. Because I think pretty much we're all confused. We're all sailing in the same boat. So we all have certain insights, certain entry points, I think, depending on the kind of literature that we are conversant with. But I think there are two or three major questions that have come, which really I think one should further push on. That is, first, I think partly I've addressed Anupama's questions in my, so I'm moving on to Prashanto's question in terms of this two parts. That one, that there is a pragmatic realist, and then there is this normative. I think that's the churning. If I say is what is happening in political theory across, that that there are no old normative guarantees the way they were once upon a time. But then that's the old debate between immanence and transcendence. That is it the role of political theory, or is it the role of political analysis to give a normative directionality to the process you are trying to understand? Now, this is a very interesting debate between Axel Honneth and Jeffrey Alexander. One of the comments that Honneth makes with Jeffrey Alexander is that in tracing the real, and in terms of subjective responses, uh, there is no overarching normative preference in cultural sociology, like in a book like Civil Sphere, for instance, or in his work on performance, power and performance. So where do you get back that normative? That I think your reading is perfectly right, Prashant. It's something that one is struggling with, that one does not want to give up the idea of the normative. Then we all become modern Abhimanyus. You can chop off everything and enter something, and then what? What comes? I think then then we die. Exactly. We have no choice but to die. So since I do not want myself or others to die, I hold on to some normative ground. Yeah. But obviously, I'm not in a rush to impose this as my analytical frame on the process itself. But I do not want a normative frame to make sense of what's happening on the ground, which is what I think much of liberal and left, though Rajarshi conveniently left out left, but we have to put left in that place, that both liberal and left, I think one of the problems has been a certain rigidity to the normative frame, which is what is the distinction I make between morality and ethics. Ethics as an open-ended experiment, which are contextually in a very relational sense, but morality is something that is deeply structured. So that's the difference I make between ethics. That people in their everyday life have ethical preferences, which are fungible, which are contextual, which are relationally defined. Right has an hegemonic project of a preordained moral worldview, which is hierarchical, which is based on purity, pollution, and so on and so on. Greatness of civilization, ethos. I don't think there is an immediate match. So what I see in my analysis is that there is that hiatus between what is being mobilized and what one is mobilizing. What emotions do to political mobilizations and what political mobilization do to emotions, I think there's a hiatus. To give a quick example, since Rajarshi raised a question of sense of belonging, I do feel that Wright is able to give a deep sense of cultural belonging through public display of religiosity, language of civilization, kind of vernacularization that Vivek was talking about. But sense of belonging is not the purpose where the right-wing project of hegemony ends. So there is that match, convergence, there is also that mismatch. And that's where one has to analyze that where does this so the moment you simply criticize people's ethical preferences as being majoritarian, that's why I critique the idea of Islamophobia. People don't rush to be Islamophobic. So the point is to disaggregate those categories that we have employed in public domain, which seems to bring too many variables, coalesce them, and offer us a flattened analysis, which is what I think much of liberal left and, if I may say, post-colonial analysis has done. The point is really to disaggregate those variables in their workings, and that's one thing is what interests me as a critical theory teaches us is to look at it in its working, not in its moral frame, or not in terms of ideal type imaginations. That in their workings, how do these categories play out? Therefore, the first question. Huh? Oh, I've only started with okay. So with okay, then I'll have to pick and choose. So of course, I have a lot to say on solidarity, question of left populism. That Prashant raised very important questions. Well, with Vivek, I think we have big time disagreements. There's no point hiding them over. I'm not a great champion of vernacularization, partly because I've not read that literature, so that's one convenient way of putting of rasa. And the other, I'm not genuinely fascinated by, as a political theorist, watching what vernacularization has done to Indian democracy over the last 3 decades. I'm not a great champion of vernacular. First, we began by arguing that is everything in Hindi, kuch acha ho jayega. Then we said anthropological argument of people belonging to politics of presence, there will be radical transformation. Then we now talk about local ethics. But I would agree that there is a certain resonance. But simply vernacularization itself as something that will capture something very fundamental about our social ethos, I have serious doubts. That's, I think, a very old-time foundationalism working itself. That there is something given in terms of its matrix. Once you get that, then you have had it. I think post-colonial scholars for a long time tried to drive us in that route. One has to only read Richard Wallin's Seduction of Unreason to see where that would lead us. That this immediate critique of quote unquote Western is something that simply doesn't attract me. That we have to engage longer, and I've not come across. There are claims, these are continuous claims that we are saying something different and authentic, but frankly, all that post-colonial literature that I've read, we come back to those questions of democracy. For instance, Chatterjee's entire discourse on secularism, tolerance and secularism, then you come back to saying that it's about democracy within those religious councils. There's an internal voting process. So I think this entire tradition modernity conversation is also pretty exhausted as I speak. That something else is happening on the ground. So Vivek, we'll have to hold horses, and we will pick that up some other time. And my only question for you would be, let's think in terms of the relation between vernacularization and foundational. We are, I think, moved far away in terms of an anti-foundationalist movement, and therefore we'll have to think that how to invoke that vernacularization. And a quick correction, Vivek, your reading is not true that I placed my premium on facts. If you read the introduction, I begin with Jeffrey Alexander's quote by saying that evidence and facts don't answer narrative. But to say that there can be narratives minus all reference to the real is also something that I think. So what that tension does, I think, is a very open-ended, productive tension. So I don't at all argue that simply narrating evidence and facts. In fact, I've argued article after article that this is not the way to address right wing. Simply putting evidence on that wouldn't answer anything. And to Rajershi's, well, I don't know which Ajay has to answer him, but let me gather to see which of your points should I. Well, on the question of, you have raised questions that I think I have taken on in terms of, do we really have a majority? If so, what kind of a majority is this? And this is a question that also interested me, between force and hegemony. Why would a regime that ostensibly enjoys a certain mode of culture and hegemony, why would it be so pathological in its use of violence? So this is a question of making a distinction between force, violence, authority. So those questions would be relevant, but this is something that intrigues me. In fact, in my conversations with my right-wing friends, I often say that we will be much better off dropping this ugly public demonstration of mob lynchings, persecution of individuals, use of Pegasus, doing what you do in JNU. I mean, this is an unwarranted project. But obviously, this is where I say that these are desperate variables, like an assemblage. I think they have their origin somewhere else. It has nothing to do to say that there is no cultural element. They are doing this in spite of the cultural element, which is good for us. So that is what is going to spell a fair enough big challenge. But that force, again, as I argue in the piece on the betrayal, I think has a long history of caste dominations being challenged. I think the anxieties and insecurities born, which is reasonable sense of betrayal, is what the force. It has nothing to do with the reading of cultural element. So I think these are very disparate phenomena that we'll have to. But the problem with much of our liberal left is that we quickly kind of push them together to say that if there is hegemony by force, or the presence of force would necessarily mean that there is no cultural hegemony. So I would read it differently, that there is force in spite of cultural hegemony, and the sources of these are very, very, very different. Similarly, as I would say on the ground, much of what right is getting right is that they have given a deep sense of cultural belonging, but that sense of cultural belonging, right, wishes to convert it at some point into a toxic majoritarian consensus, as Ashwarya Kumar says in terms of majoritarian consensus. But would that happen? And that's why I argue in a classical tradition immanence that there are contradictions within immanence, that those everyday ethics that make people buy into the hegemonic project of the right are also the ethics that people are going to resist. That's what we find in daily riots. If you read the narratives that happen, that people were going out of their way to protect Muslims. So people wouldn't buy. And this was an old question in the left civil liberties debate that happened in Telangana. The Balgopal, one of the early, Anupama, you would know this debate where he argued that tribals might come with the Maoists for the question of immediacy of their vulnerability. But why should Maoist tribals believe in the Maoist project of restructuring the state? So there is a convergence and divergence. I think it is that tension. If I say that, that's what the book tries to be. Thanks very much.
So my question was that of many kind of conundrums and many kind of oxymorons in the prices that we're talking about during the lecture. One, you talked about that how Rice was able to capture the popular emotion. But sir, if you see or do some kind of deeper reflection of this topic, you see that the emotions that look so popular today, they were not popular at one point of time. And still Wright was working in a very resilient and assiduous manner on those emotions, like the repeating of Article 370 from Daphne. Today we can see that it has got a sense of resonance and relevance to the popular cause of the people. But there was one point of time where there were no takers of these things in those terms. But still there was a configuration of emotion, of the sustainability of emotion that were done by the writer. So, sir, this kind of consolidation of emotion, which looks a little different from capturing the very aspect of popular emotion that on the ground. So is it some kind of provoking you to actually foreground these facts and findings in the new registers of theoretical permutation, or the new registers of theoretical?
Let's correct questions. Let's have 3 or 4 questions. Please introduce yourself.
JNU से बाहर मैं जर्नलिस्ट रहा हूँ और इस सभा से मैंने सर की किताबें पढ़ी हुई थी तो मैं आना चाहूँ। मेरा सवाल अजय सर से है, ये जो हेट्रेड फार्मिंग या इमोशन मैनिपुलेशन का जो गेम है, ये कितना हद तक मैकेनिकल हो चुका है या कॉर्पोरेट मैनर में आता है? बहुत लिमिटेड टाइम पे वैरायटी ऑफ हेट्रेड क्रिएट किए जा रहे हैं और बहुत हाई प्रोडक्टिविटी के साथ, और उसकी एक हेजेमनी जो कि है और इसका जो कॉर्पोरेट मैनर है कि बहुत कम समय में वैरायटी ऑफ हेट्रेड क्रिएट किए जा रहे हैं, इसको किस हद तक आप देख रहे हैं और देख सकते हैं?
Other questions? So, Ajay, would you want to?
Yeah. So quickly, I think both questions are closely related, both Rakesh and your questions, in terms of are these emotions given, or is that the emotions themselves have been constructed, socially constructed? I think that's a key. If you look at new literature on emotion studies, look at this book on emotions in South Asia. this is a question they try to grapple with, that there is a certain kind of a trans-cultural character to emotions. So perhaps Vivek would disagree with that, but there is a certain questions of dignity, anger, hatred, they exist across board. But how they get defined, or what texture they assume, seems to be very contextual. So this in itself, cultural sociology also draws on this, that there are large binary structures like civil and uncivil. But what becomes civil and what becomes uncivil is very contextually. Okay, so there is a continuous tussle between something that gets transculturally communicated and something that gets contextually defined. And part of that I try to do in this book is to look at how this contextual tussle happens, like hatred and anger. Now, we can make a heuristic analytical distinction between these two, but when you look closely on the ground, it's very difficult to analyze as to when that pushover happens, that when does anger begin to work like hatred, or from what vantage point does one understand? Should it be purely subjective? Should there be a social analysis? Should there be an ethical analysis of this? That becomes a complex process. I think pretty much similar to your question of emotions. No, one thing I don't say anywhere in the book, manipulation. I think that's a bad term. I don't like that term. I think nothing gets manipulated. Even for a manipulative strategy to work, it has to seep through certain cultural codes. And I make that point in my chapter on media. That, this quick dismissal we do of fake news and things of that kind, it might be fake. But even for the fake news to assume a proportion of simulacra, that they compel you to look at reality through that frame they offer, it has to resonate with something. People are not going to believe anything and everything. People are not going, even if Mr. Modi were to tomorrow say that he's going to take us all to moon, I don't think people will trust. Well, he might say, that I don't deny. But the fact that people will begin to believe just because he said it, I don't think it's going to work. I think, therefore, these are very closely calibrated, what we call fake news, is happening within an echo chamber. That's also my answer to Rajesh's question, that is the right getting it right? I think they're getting it right, because that even the fake news, what they've generated, and they know where it works, when it does not work. Look at Telangana. If you observe elections closely and their campaigns, Telangana, they've prepared a fertile ground for communal polarization in terms of changing of names. They have suddenly discovered a temple next to Charminar, the usual game, which is a very pretty. But they don't immediately jump and start mobilizing. There's a method. There's a ground mobilization, there's a door-to-door campaign. They link that what we call quote-unquote communalism or what we call quote-unquote Hindutva has multiple variable meanings on the ground. They link it to place of gender, they link it to place of religion, local culture, family, and then over a period that erupts into public violence. So if you miss this background story, then we will never be able to make. Then it looks simply a polarization. Simply it looks between force versus cultural hegemony. They are closely calibrating that all on the ground, that how these variables work. Therefore, they're continuous. If you look at their narratives, they don't relax. So there are no multiple agendas. There's only one Modi who never relaxes. Their campaigns flow one after another because part of their problem is that they are unable to convert this polarization into hysteria. So that's where is the opening for us to analyze that that's the difference between ethics and morality. Structured moral structure of the right allows them to self-delude, believing that this will one day break into hysteria. And my argument continues that it's next to impossible to build hysteria in India. And that's because of the dispersed nature of ethics, and therefore the counter ethics can flow very easily. The same contextually, it can take a different direction very easily. And that's why my continuous plea to our left liberal oppositional forces, including what you refer NRC, CAA, I don't think they don't generate that enough ethical emotive valuation. That is still flows in this vague constitutional democracy. I mean, it might still work because of a certain context, but I think we can do much better if we can convert this constitutional language, democracy, into the language of everyday ethics. And that I think squarely comes, that discomfort squarely comes from a certain social locationality from which this left liberal project works. That's where I can partly borrow from post-colonial, saying that it has to be something else, but that is not vernacularization. So I can stop here. Let's take the questions even if we don't have elaborate, just to listen to what they have to say.
So there was a hand at the back next to Ashley and so quick, make your questions brief then, right?
Come in the order. Just wait for your turn.
Then let's go in this.
So one of the points that you made is that there's a lot of different types of because but they're communicated in terms of culture, features of culture. So I want to understand how are you explaining this shift? Why are people finding it more complicated to use idioms of culture? And the second is that I wanted to understand, are you drawing any kind of analytical distinction between the sense of cultural belonging that you're talking about and mobilization based on cultural belonging? So are parties actually mobilizing on this basis, or are they essentially just communicating a sense of cultural belonging? And also, when you're talking about populism in a sense of progressive populism, we talk about, so where do you see this shift towards culture in politics in that sense? Why is culture becoming more important in your opinion? Anil?
First, I would like to congratulate you for the funding. I could not have been much better than could not be. My actually same. My question is in terms of basically I'm referring to one of the chapters that you written about Kashmir. My question is you're talking about a third alternative in which you are presenting a different set of solutions which will come and take over the other set of solutions that you that is hatred and anger. But my question is in terms of Kashmir, I mean, in terms of that, in terms of the colonization of the land that was made use of that thing. I think in that case, you have a polar emotions which are polar apart from each other. Hatred as well as love coming together into play. For example, you have people who hate Kashmiri men, but well as on the other hand, you have people who love Kashmiri women. Also, you have brought in the case of Modi, where he is saying that he's giving an Eid Mubarak to Kashmiris, while Kashmiris are themselves incarcerated. These are two emotions which are polar apart from each other. You have love and hatred. So my question is, what is the evaluation ground on this? How would you say, on this, how would you judge emotions? Because you're saying that hatred is to be overridden by love, but in this case, you have hatred as well as love playing pretty much their part in the colonization of the land, as well as colonization of the people. So my argument, I'm saying, how would you think beyond institutions or think beyond facts and history, in making a critique of this kind of colonization, apart from emotions?
Okay, so firstly, congratulations for your book. So when you were raising the question of narrativization, it immediately led me to the relationship between the emotions and the politics of knowledge. So basically, why is it that only certain fabricated offensive representations of the other, say the Muslim or the Christian or the Dalit, are immediately captured by the popular Hindu imagination? And how those imaginations, exaggerations, and fantasies are producing and reproducing a Hindu nationalist subject, uh, and laying out a relationship with the other. So I think, in my opinion, this relationship is more of a negative consciousness in which the Hindu nationalist subject is not what he is, but what the other is not. So how do you see?
Okay,
Thank you.
So the three of you, quickly.
Congratulations, Dr. Gudavarti, on the book. I think the book gives numerous different frames through which we can see various things, and one of the frames in particular that interests me for a long time, and you've been arguing this, that Indian public sphere can be characterized as swinging public sphere, the oscillating public sphere. So it seems as if the Indian
identity is itself schizophrenic. That at one moment he says something, and after he gave this famous example in the class as well, that after three pegs of whiskey, they would say something else. So what is I? I mean, you also mentioned that it doesn't lead to hysteria. It doesn't lead to hysteria and kicks back in. So I mean, is there some historical ground to that? I mean, that swinging, oscillating public sphere. And if there is a historical ground, what is that? And if there is a historical ground, then would you not have to engage then with questions that Vivek raised? I mean, going back, I mean, going back into history or in directions of anthropology, then you will have to engage then with the vernacular or the popular. So how
So my question, congratulations for your book, sir. My question is related to the book that you are holding and referring to, and this is the problem that I find in that book as well. It refers Hochschild 1979's article where he makes a distinction between feeling and emotion and regards feeling as something non-reflexive. Now, what I get from your book that you two are using those non-reflexive categories to understand what mobilizations do to emotion. So, where is the aspect of that activity which has certain sense of let's say reason and rationality or reflexivity attached to it, which is called emotion? So, is it more that you are confining yourself to feeling and trying to understand the what mobilization do to emotion? Secondly, what Professor Dasgupta has pointed out, I mean, approach that you have taken is more of sociologistical approach, which this book itself argues, and this book too fails to clarify this. But the psychologistical approach, which gives an idea of inside out rather than outside in, is something missing in this book as well. And I think that also leads us to a question that had that been taken care of, we could have understood that why people are acting at one point in one manner and at the other point in other manner, especially related to right wing. Because when I was doing survey with Aam Aadmi Party, and for Aam Aadmi Parties, during Aam Aadmi Party's election in CSTS, some people said that they like to have Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, but BJP at center. So this distinction, is it because of that failure? But how does this happen? Is it because of that absence that you are leaving behind this psychological approach?
And then Hong Chui gets the last one.
Figures.
First, let Himanshu. Yeah,
Go
continue,
on, go on.
please go ahead. Hong Chui, we can't
louder
hear
here,
you.
Hong
Do
Chui.
you want to come up here?
However, how do we take into account when relationship between the some or idea being high or and then we go to the starting from emotional. We need to separate what is your funding. We need to follow for which we need to let go of the excess. We necessarily take into account the whole process of then we can go along the process and institutions, all hence the realization of the tendency. Another thing is one word has is the importance of power. How power and emotion with regard can we technically power and take into account we're talking about the cultural stuff. And by focusing on one term, it can give up many terms, which in a way. So yes, would be only a matter of dialectic processes, or in terms of the relevance, or how to really pick up the whole cultural morality, even how do we really reorganize those in here or
There's one last question.
So, my question is that you say that there is a convergence between everyday ethics and structural morality of the right. So, if
There is no conversion.
Sometimes, yeah, on occasion, and sometimes there is a conversion. So, sir, how far, or I mean, how far? What is the scale of it? How far it can go on? I mean, striking a resonance with the ethics of the popular ethics and the agenda of the right, or the I mean, the kind of morality, structural morality which right has. Yeah, when it will start hampering it.
So then, I just have one question. Is, specifically for Dr. Murali, you seem largely agree with Dr. Dasgupta when it comes to the fact that right doesn't need force for maintaining the schedule. Like you mentioned an example that of your friends and you tell them that like, this is not necessary. Why do you think so? Because I particularly believe that like violence is complete necessity for maintaining this schedule, particularly because regulation of not just of body, physical body, but also body politics helps to maintain the hegemony and like also brings these emotions out that we talk about in the book. Like you talk about Charminar and then the temple, destruction, mutilation of that body, or like some random bomb blast that happens in Chhattisgarh or in Kashmir, or the mob lynching, or some kind of mutilation of culture. Like, so violence becomes crucial for maintaining the system. So that is what I think, but why do you believe that it is not?
Okay, so Professor Buddhavarti gets about 5 minutes.
Well, so 5 minutes is simply impossible. So I'll have to choose. Yeah, I will choose some questions. Like the third one, this question of Abik or someone raised that. Did you raise the question of why only offensive emotions? That's an interesting question. I mean, I partly try to deal with that. Something that engaged me also. That why one come to think of it that only offensive emotions. Again, this question I think has something to do with if you look at Ben Anderson's work on neoliberalism and the right, he talks about at the heart of it is the project of intensification. This is the speed and the scale. Therefore, one has to see this offensive also in terms of digitalization on one hand and this repeated mention of speed and scale. We are going on a different speed. So one has to draw this interpretative link between this building largest statue, bullet train. So that only we can do through cultural sociology. I mean, critical theory simply doesn't allow you through a structured analysis to draw. But in terms of our human imagination, these linkages pretty much work. So I think this binary between intensification and boredom. I think that this project also is addressing this perennial anomie, boredom, and nihilism that modernity has thrust upon us. So I think we'll have to understand that why offensive emotions at this stage, not only in India, that's happening across, including in social democratic countries like Sweden. Now there has been repeated violence against migrants. So this would therefore need cultural categories outside neoliberalism, and not that all that is irrelevant. That cultural sociology, that's where I disagree with cultural sociology, that they simply push that. But I think that provides, therefore we need these multiple variables to continuously kind of have a micro logical view of what works when. And there is no guarantee as to how it's going to flow. Well, love and hatred, I think I've already mentioned, we have had some discussion on this. Oscillating, that's a good question, Supriya, as to where does this oscillating public sphere come? Part of the reasoning I give is in terms of what Barrington Moore talks about Hinduism, that it is in terms of a dispersed religious sensibilities which are fairly local, that as much as I can think, that's where I draw that one cannot have a structure. So to that extent, I think those specificities are important. So my problem with post-colonial scholarship is that to wear those specificities on sleeves. I think every scholar who writes in India, and this is something Vivek, you should tell me that even a classical liberal scholar who writes, I think writes about specificities in India. Nobody simply reproduces. I mean, even somebody as classical, pristine as Gurpreet Mahajan, If you read her work on identities and rights, talks about what happened in Indian case, how it sidesteps certain liberal institutional proclivities. How did it work differently? Why do we have a group majority, group rights as against individual rights? So, but you are pushing for a much deeper case for vernacularization as this foundational case. But once you hit, then you have something deeper that I'm not very clear. So there are specificities which we'll have to, but I don't think there is an essentialized specificity that Western categories simply do not. And here I absolutely stand with Amartya Sen, who says that people across globe are thinking about issues of rights, dignity, recognition. And these are not mutually exclusive variables. That there is nothing so specific that obviously vernacularization would add another dimension of certain kind of specificity. But politically, we know what vernacularization can also very quickly spill over into chauvinism. What has happened to linguistic movements? What has happened to Hindi heartland case? All those demands that began with this kind of a post-colonial vernacularization did end up with, as cosmopolitan end up with liberal hegemonic project, vernacularization can be very much bottom-up. So that's my case in terms of why that I'm not pleading against study of vernacular, but certain essentialization and foundationalism that comes that once you study this vernacularization, then you are ipso facto democratizing and hitting at an alternative mode of, I think that I'll have serious problems with. Feelings and emotions, somebody asked, I think you made this point about feelings and why not psychological categories? No, I'm more interested in intersubjective social psychology. Therefore, I would be interested in somebody like Eric Fromm's writings. In collective context, like a cultural trauma. In collective context, how does memory create certain psychological dispensations? I'm not particularly moved by individual psychology and digging into individual psychology, talking about sex drives, fantasy. Somehow, they might contextually kick in, but they don't particularly. I don't think they particularly. They might capture something, but I'm not driven by. So I'm more into social psychology. That in intersubjective context, how does imagination come about? That's I think Eric Fromm is one good social psychologist who, and much of cultural sociology has unstated psychological assumptions about. But individual as a unit, I think does not particularly attract. Objectivity, Anshu, you are now back to objectivity. Obviously, things are objective now. We are not denying. So I think the overall thrust is precisely to say this, that we need to come out of these binaries. Reason, emotion, even feelings, emotion. I think there is a certain, as I continuously mentioned, a certain fluidity and fungibility that happens. So, the old works on crowd and mob took emotions as if they were unreflexive, as if they had no interest. It was just an emotive outburst. But today we know that emotions also have calculated instrumental value. I think, and if you look at populism closely, and I think I make this in one of the articles, that what today you have is an instrumentalized emotion. You have emotions without vulnerability. Badiou talks about love as this unpredictable encounter. I think what populism does in its deployment of emotions is that it is that encounter without that unpredictable. That it's therefore creating a new dimension of emotions. Now, why should that be attractive instead of, let's say, the kind of premium that Badiou lays on love, that it has to be authentic love. It has to have no calculation. That it has to be an unpredictable encounter. I think that doesn't work. There are social realities, social locations. There's caste, there's gender that we work through. Therefore, simply that kind of an unpredictable encounter is enchanting, but can be quite what do you want to say? Can be destabilizing, and you can end up paying heavy costs. Let me put it this way. How far? What is this? You asked this question. How far? I think there is no blueprint, right? How far do ethics work, counter ethics? It all depends on counter mobilization. And if you have the kind of counter mobilization we have in India right now, this might last our lifetime. so what you need an effective. I think therefore I continuously argue that populism at the heart of it is an anti-elitist project. That they're able to have that local idiom, they're able to mobilize in terms of that common sense, they're able to mobilize in terms of everyday ethics and emotion. And I think that comes from a social occasionality. That's where I think one has to link it back to social occasionality. That part of the reason that Congress party and other regional parties are really struggling to have, even when there's an existential crisis, is because I think they don't have those tools to get that counter mobilized. So that therefore there is also that question of how social occasionality works. Therefore, I would feel a leader like Akhilesh might be much better off in generating a common sense local. If you look at within Congress too, Baghel does much better than other leaders. There is something to it. To why he gets those notes right, that cultural force, the way he kicks in. So how it depends on counter mobilization, social occasionality, all these factors one has to. And Vinit's question in terms of violence, well, what I mean here is this, that if you look at, there are two dimensions to the mobilization, right? One is Sabka Saath, then you have the religion, everybody as a Hindu, then you have a civilizational greatness, a long civilizational history. In all of this, they're talking of Indic civilization, they're talking of Indic Islam today. It's a normative universal that they are creating. And my argument is that it is this normative universal that is at the heart of popular consent for this regime. But the problem with the regime itself, being what they are, given the history of RSS, given the history of Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and now Bajrang Dal, I mean, we are progressively, we can go down pecking order, is precisely that they don't trust that normative universal. That's where, therefore we have to make these nuanced distinctions that, as you say, that violence is necessary, but necessary for what? Violence is necessary not for cultural hegemony. Violence is necessary to convert this cultural hegemonic consent into a majoritarian historical order. I think these are two different projects altogether. I do not know how much of right understands this, but they could well be hegemonic with the first, and they don't need the latter. But obviously, because of that's where ideology kicks in. That ideological vision of a hierarchical society, a belief in caste order, exaggerated caste egos, all of that is what requires violence. So I don't think a popular ethic unproblematically supports that violence. It's filtered. Therefore, the question of gratitude, guilt, there are other ways they're filtering how the consent is happening is through other variables. So I think we have to make this distinction to see how sustainable this matrix is. Because now they are riding a popular wave, it looks, but there are these huge chicks within that right-wing assemblage, that all these processes don't go together at all.
Yeah.
There's one more
There's
question.
one question from Rashi and Prashanto wants to take 1 minute.
Oh yes, sure, question. Yeah, I think rest of you also, if you wish to jump in and say something.
So my question is
Sure, go ahead.
my question is it possible to think that at some point both language and philosophy converge in logo? Logo is not just as reason, but the structure in which reasoning is done. So going by that, is it possible to think that we can in some ways retain the logic or logos of Indian philosophy without the vernacular? Is it possible? Without the vernacular or the language, without Sanskrit, is it possible? Would that be a response to the critique of vernacularization?
Should I go ahead?
Thanks very much for that question. I think that's a fantastic question because it actually helps you make a point that I wanted to make about what the Guruvati said. I think I am very much of the conviction that there is no way to extricate thought from language. Right? This idea that I think this kind of idea which was articulated by Wittgenstein in his earlier work, Tractatus. And I think people like Bernard Russell also believe in this, that you could, the terms, the words of different languages, they actually refer to an underlying, sort of referent, which is the same in every language. So it's actually possible according to that view, for different concepts in different languages to map onto each other perfectly. I think that, if you take the later Wittgenstein or the work of people like Hans Georg Gadamer from the hermeneutic school, they would say that, thinking resides in language. So much so that there is no way of actually extricating thought from language. But this is not to say that, what can be. So I think in the Indian subcontinent, because the Indian vernaculars have come out of Sanskrit and have been also partly influenced by Farsi, right? It has the Indian vernaculars. Their concepts are interchangeable in a way that the concepts of, say, Telugu and German are not. Right? So that's, I think, and that is why I believe that, in order to do political theory, because what is political theory? Where do you get your concepts from? Right? You get them from the language of the practitioners. Political theory must start from there, because political theory is not really about, making castles in the air. It's about clarifying a practice to the practitioners themselves. And unlike, nature, social sciences studies a human phenomena, right, which the practitioners already have an understanding of. Right? So you begin with that understanding and then distill it to make it reflexive. And that, at least to my understanding, is the task of theory. That's a kind of interpretive. Right? The task of theory is to actually interpret the political vernacular, or, the practical understanding of any practice. And if you take that view, then you have to begin with the language of the practitioner.
Prashant, you want to take your 1 minute? And then
Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. No. It's not a big. Yeah, it's a very trivial thing. I don't know, where psychology begins and where social psychology starts, where, political conflict begins and where literature ends. I mean, these are disciplines. I just remember an old poem because I'm a student of literature. It's another Dasgupta, from Bengal. His name is was Pranabendu Das. And he's a very understated great poet. So he has this very small poem called It Rained. It rained. And the short poems somewhat like, I don't remember the exact line, but somewhat like that. A few friends like this, whether like this. Different friends met, they would go and watch a film. Now they met and then they met in a room and then there was a power cut, load shedding. As the power cut for 5 minutes or 7 minutes. In that point of time, something happened inside them when there was power cut. Each of them are thinking suddenly about various incidents that has happened among them and various subterranean, tension between them. And each of them someone wants to hit the other, someone wants to take a tool by which some older jealousy will be, satisfied, some other, deep darker things, and then the power comes back. The moment the power comes back, everyone is rational, deliberative, normative, whatever you call it. But the problem ends the poem by, it could have been different, things could have been nice and sweet, but it rained.
Ma'am, you want to say something?
Okay. Thank you to all the panelists. Ajay Godavarti, Professor Shanta Chakravarti, Professor Rajarshi Dasgupta, Professor Vivek Yadav, and especially to Professor Anil Kumar Roy for chairing the session. Round of applause for all of them. And to our audience who always turns up for our events. There is tea waiting outside. The tea is also by student run initiative. So have tea outside. Thank you.
Yeah.